For the first step in this kit, we're going to be determining how to position the sticker paper or sticker transfer paper with our design to your shirt. Now, I'm using a shirt that I thrifted that I wanted to give some new life to. I would suggest using any kind of shirt that you can easily sew the thicker strands of thread through. Depending on the neckline of the shirt of your choice, it may be easier for you to cut your sticker paper into separate sections in order to best align it with your neckline and the shoulders. I've now cut my sticker paper or stick and stitch paper into 3 separate sections. The next step is going to be peeling off the backing and actually adhering our sticker paper with the adhesive side down onto our piece of clothing. Make sure to give the sticker paper a good press so that it's truly sticking to your fabric. For the next step, we'll be taking the Beechwood embroidery hoop and placing it so that the inner hoop, or the hoop without the brass screw, is on the inside of the shirt, and the portion with the brass screw is on the outside of the shirt. That way you can make sure that you can tighten or loosen as needed. Since I'm working with a thicker fabric, I'm going to need mine to be a little bit looser as I'm placing my hoop. I'm also trying to make sure that I'm leaving open some areas where I can best access the stems and the leaves, as that's the first stitch that we're going to begin with. Once I have my hoop on the fabric, I'm going to very gently pull around the outside edges of the hoop, just to make sure that the fabric inside the hoop is a bit more taut. This will make it easier as we're sewing. Once I've completed that step, I'm going to tighten the screw to ensure that everything stays in place. For the stems, we'll begin with the light green thread that's number 166. We're going to keep all 6 strands of embroidery floss together as we're sewing the stems. Begin by cutting approximately 1.5 arms length of thread. Next, we'll thread the needle. We're going to keep all of our strands of thread for this project as single strands, meaning we're not going to pull this short end all the way to meet the opposite end of the thread. Next, we'll create a knot at the end of our thread. Take the end of the longer piece of thread and cross it behind your needle, making the shape of a lowercase t or a cross. Pinch the section where the thread and the needle intersect. On the side where you have a large loop, take the thread and wrap it around the needle 2 to 3 times. Pinch that new section where you've just wrapped the thread around the needle. Gently begin to slide that section down the length of the needle over the eye, wiggling slightly while maintaining that pinched section. Continue to pull the thread all the way through while still pinching the wrapped thread. Once you have gotten to the point where you cannot pull anymore, you'll end up with a knot at the very end of your thread. For the stems, we'll begin using a split stitch with the light green thread. Let's take the needle and bring it up from behind the fabric through the end of one of the stems. Bring the needle back down on the line of the stem about 1/4 inch from where you began. Bring the needle back up through the fabric about 1/8 of an inch from the end of the last stitch you created. Then bring the point of the needle back down through about the halfway point of the last stitch you created. Try to split the 6 strands of thread in half the best that you can. It's called a split stitch, as we are quite literally splitting the threads. We'll repeat this whole sequence again. Bring the needle up about 1/4 or 1/8 of an inch away from the end of your last stitch, and then bring it down through approximately the halfway point of the last stitch, splitting the threads. We'll repeat this for the full length of the stems. When you get down to about 5 or 6 inches of thread, we'll have to tie it off and secure a knot. Thread the needle underneath the last stitch you created until you've created a loop, and then bring the needle through that loop and pull. Repeat this step again, threading the needle underneath the last stitch you created until you have a small loop, and bringing the needle back through that loop and pulling taut. Then you can trim off any of the excess ends, leaving at least about 1/4 of an inch of thread for a tail. Ends, leaving a little over 1/4 of an inch of thread as a little tail. If you need to, at this point, rethread your needle and tie a new knot at the end of your thread. For our next stitch, we will be using a satin stitch to create our leaves with the dark green thread. Let's start from the back of the fabric. For this particular design, we are going to be making the leaves stitches go in a horizontal fashion. A satin stitch is essentially a bunch of straight stitches that are used to cover a solid area. I'm going to bring my needle up through one edge of the leaf and then back down through the opposite end of the leaf for my first stitch. Now, personally, because I like to conserve thread, I am going to bring my next stitch back up fairly close to the end of the last stitch that I created, and then back down again through the opposite side, keeping my stitches as close together as possible. We'll continue repeating this until we have filled in this entire solid area. If you prefer, you can also, instead of trying to conserve the thread, go back across each time. So what I mean by that is I just came down through the fabric on this side of the leaf. So instead of coming back up on the same side of the leaf for this next stitch, I can go back instead to the opposite side if I am afraid perhaps of accidentally coming up through the same hole or creating too much space between my stitches. We'll also be using the satin stitch to create the petals of some of the flowers. In order to do so, instead of going horizontal as we did on the leaves, we are going to be coming out vertically from the flowers. In this case, I'm starting on this particular flower on the inside of the pattern, and I'm going to be kind of following along where I see these jagged lines because the stitches are going to be ending at different points. I'm keeping my stitches parallel and fairly close together so you don't see much space in between. The next kind of stitch that we'll be going over is called the lazy daisy stitch. We're going to begin with one of these flowers that have these long and skinny petals. We'll start by bringing the needle up from the inner center of one of those petals. From there, we're going to bring our needle either back down through the same exact hole or one just next to it, but we're going to leave a bit of a loop. On the opposite side of the petal, we're going to come up through the end from the back side of the fabric and pull until the loop becomes taut around that section of thread. Then we're going to secure this in place by bringing our needle down over the other side of the end of that petal or the other side of the thread to anchor it in place. And then we just repeat that for each of the petals. The next kind of stitch that we will be using is called a French knot. We'll be using the French knot for the insides of all of the flowers. We're going to start by bringing our needle up from the back of the fabric and then grab the thread about an inch away from where it's coming out of the fabric and wrap that section around the needle 2 times. Then bring the needle back down right next to or even through the same hole through which you came up. Hold this section of thread taut and so that it's flush with the fabric as you pull the needle and the thread back through to the other side. And you'll see it creates a little knot on the surface here. For the inside of the tiny flowers, we'll be creating a singular French knot For this one, if you would like to make the French knot larger, after you come up from the back of the fabric and you loop around the needle, instead of looping twice, you could loop around 3 times to make a larger knot. Basically, to create a smaller knot, you loop less times around the needle. To create larger knots, you loop more times around the needle. Then place your needle back down through the center of the flower and pull through. We'll also be using French knots to create the berries along the stems. The very last stitch for this kit is completely optional, so it's up to you whether or not you decide you would like to utilize this. But if you do, we'll be using the light green thread in order to both outline and create a little bit of a stem coming down the center of the leaves. In order to do that, we're going to be splitting the threads only for this stitch. Hold the threads close to the end of your embroidery floss and begin to tap until they start to separate. While we're still pinching, start to pull on one of the strands of thread, pulling all the way through. We're going to do this for 2 strands of the thread. If you need, you might need to pull on the other side where the thread begins to bunch. Next, we'll take the 2 strands that we've separated and put 2 of the ends so that they're lined up as close together as possible. We are then going to thread these 2 ends through a needle, and you are welcome to use a needle threader if you would like. And we're going to pull the ends through all the way until you're meeting the opposite 2 ends. So in a sense, you are halving the thread or doubling the thread. And then just like we did earlier, we'll tie a knot at the end of the thread. This last stitch is the back stitch. We're going to be coming up from behind the fabric with our needle from one of the points of the leaves. Then we're going to, around the outline or the edge of the leaf, come back down about 1/4 of an inch away from where we brought the needle up. Then on the outline of the leaf, a little further ahead, about 1/4 of an inch, we'll come back up. And then we're going to come back down through the hole that we made at the end of that last stitch that we can see. So you're going back to the end of that last stitch, hence the name, the back stitch. And we'll keep repeating this step from here. So I'm going forward a little, about 1/4 of an inch, and then going back down through the end of the last stitch I created. The very last thing that we are going to do here is create one long straight stitch going down the center of the leaf. I'm going to bring my needle up through one end of the leaf and then right back down through the opposite end of the leaf. And if you want, you could just try to push it the side the best that you would like. After you've finished all of your stitching, you can remove the hoop, and then we're going to begin to trim any excess of the water-soluble sticky paper. So first, I'm just gonna trim around the edges a little bit here and there, and just be mindful as you do this that you're not accidentally cutting the fabric of the shirt itself. So in some areas, I might gently tear and pull away. Being very cautious here, just trimming here and there. For the next step, you can either use the sink or a basin of water like I'm doing here. We're going to take our shirt and we're going to submerge it in our water. You can let that soak for a few seconds. You'll see how the water-soluble paper is already starting to come off here. Now, something else that I like to do is have a clean toothbrush on hand that I can use to very gently scrub away any stubborn pieces of the water-soluble paper that are refusing to come up. I'm going to start to gently agitate the fabric that's been sitting submerged in the water for a couple minutes now. You can see how those pieces are starting to break away. And you can also see where in some areas it's continuing to stick. So this is where I like to take the toothbrush, and while keeping it submerged underwater, I'm very gently just going to begin scrubbing away at some of those areas that are stubborn. Now this will also come out more the more that you wash it. If you'd like, at any point, you can also freshen up your batch of water and dump this water out and get a new clean batch of water. After you've finished washing off any of the sticky paper residue, you can hang your shirt to dry. Congratulations on finishing your piece.